July 15th, 1944, Saint-Lô, northern France. Dawn light barely cut the mist. The air was heavy, thick with diesel, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of blood. This was a graveyard of tanks and men. Through the early morning haze, an American M4 Sherman, callsign Grey Ghost, crept forward. Its treads churned through muddy hedgerows. Inside, Corporal Robert Stanton, 24 years old, stared through the foggy lens of his M70 periscope gun sight. His own heartbeat thrummed louder than the rumbling engine beneath him. Every tank vibration jolted his body. His hands, slick with sweat despite the chill, clenched the elevation controls. Just 500 yards ahead, a German Panther tank emerged from the brush. Sleek, angular, and deadly quiet, it moved like a steel predator. Its 75mm L-70 cannon swung slowly, menacingly toward the Grey Ghost. Bob's commander barked orders, but the voice sounded distant. Bob already knew the math. Their 75mm M3 cannon could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at this range. Every manual said it. Every trainer repeated it. Aim for the flanks. Avoid head-on. But this was no training exercise. There was no flank. It was now or never. Bob adjusted his sight. Not much, just a hair. A whisper. He turned the dial on the vertical elevation, what he would later measure as exactly 1 inch. That single inch wasn't in any manual. No one told him to do it. It was instinct, desperation, maybe a touch of madness. Then he fired. The shell roared from the barrel, the tank recoiling hard as smoke filled the turret. Bob's eyes stayed locked on target. For a moment, nothing. Then a flash. The Panther exploded. Flames shot from its turret as the German crew bailed. Some screamed. Some were already engulfed. Bob blinked, stunned. He looked at his commander, then the loader. No one spoke. They just stared. That one shot, after months of training, weeks of fear, and days of humiliation, had destroyed what was supposed to be an invincible enemy. All because of a tiny, almost invisible adjustment. 1 inch. That inch saved 5 American lives that day. It would go on to change everything. Meet Bob Stanton, the gunner everyone ignored. Before he became the man who killed a Panther tank with what some called luck and others called mad genius, Bob Stanton was just another quiet kid from New Hampshire. He grew up in a small town outside Concord, surrounded by pine trees and snowdrifts. Winters stretched long. Summers were short. His father, a machinist, worked on airplane parts at a local factory. His mother taught Sunday school. Bob wasn't loud, not fast, not particularly strong. But he paid attention. That was the difference. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Bob was 21. 2 months later, he signed up, asking specifically for the armored forces. Not airborne, not infantry. He didn't want to jump from planes or slog through mud with a rifle. He wanted to fight inside a machine. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, where America trained its tank crews, Bob was assigned to a Sherman. Initially, he was the loader, a sweaty, muscle-burning job of slamming 33-pound shells into a hot cannon in the middle of battle. But he was good with numbers. He could do angle calculations faster than anyone in his unit. So when the previous gunner rotated out, Bob took his place. By early 1944, he was with the 2nd Armored Division known as Hell on Wheels. They were preparing in southern England for the biggest amphibious assault in history, D-Day. Bob had never killed anyone before. He didn't talk much in camp, but he asked questions, lots of them. Why did the Sherman's cannon seem to fire low at longer ranges? Why did some crews hit targets with ease while others missed again and again? Why did some tanks burn instantly and others didn't? His sergeant once told him, "Kid, you think too much. Just aim and fire." But Bob never stopped thinking. His refusal to stop thinking would later save lives. He'd already memorized the stats. The Sherman carried a 75mm gun. Its frontal armor was about 2 inches thick. The Panther it would face had a 75mm high-velocity cannon, but its armor was 3 inches thick in front, sloped at an angle. In a fair fight, the Sherman always lost. Bob understood this. He did not accept it. He started carrying a small notebook inside his jacket. He began recording details, terrain angles, distance estimations, visibility in different weather, delays in turret rotation speed. During breaks, he'd sit in the back of the tank, tinkering with the gun sight settings, trying to understand how the M70 periscope was calibrated. No one paid much attention. He was just the quiet guy from New Hampshire who liked to scribble numbers. What they didn't realize, what even Bob didn't realize yet, was that he was building a new way to fight. Not with more firepower, not with more armor, but with precision, with 1 inch, The nickname no one wanted, the Ronson lighter. No matter how many hours Bob spent adjusting the gun sight or running mental calculations, one thought haunted him in his bunk at night. It wasn't about dying, it was about burning. Every tank crew in Normandy had heard the nickname whispered under breath. The Germans called the Sherman Tommy Cooker, as in it cooks Tommies, a grim British reference. The Americans had a name of their own. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand. Because just like the ad said, lights every time, the Sherman lit up when hit. The worst stories didn't come from the manuals. They came from the men who'd made it out. Stories of crews trapped inside burning tanks, clawing at the hatches, while fire poured through the turret ring. Some were incinerated in seconds. Others died screaming for help that never came. Once a Panther or Tiger shell penetrated the Sherman's thin frontal armor, especially if it hit near the ammo rack, the whole thing could explode. Bob didn't scare easily, but that terrified him. During training back in England, his sergeant had pulled them aside. "Listen up, boys," he'd said flat out. "The Sherman is fast, she's mobile, she can be fixed in the field, but she's not built to go toe-to-toe with a Panther or a Tiger. If you see one of those coming your way, you maneuver, you flank, you outthink them." Everyone nodded, but deep down, every man in that crew knew the truth. The Sherman was a numbers game. The plan was to build so many of them that it wouldn't matter how many burned. For every 5 Shermans that got destroyed, maybe one would get the kill. That was the math. That was the doctrine. Bob hated that math. The first time death looked him in the eye, the first time Bob Stanton faced a Panther in combat, he thought he was ready. He was wrong. It happened just outside the French village of Saint-Georges-de-Bohol, a forgotten spot on the map with nothing but hedges, barns, and fields of wheat ruined by shell fire. The day was July 18th, 1944, 3 days after the explosion at St. Lo had shattered the German front lines. The sky was overcast, a low ceiling pressing down on the countryside like a lid about to seal the fate of whoever moved beneath it. The column had been ordered to push east through what they were told was light resistance. Bob had already learned that nothing about Normandy was ever light. The terrain was a nightmare. The famed bocage, dense, tangled hedgerows that lined every field, meant tanks couldn't see more than 30 yards ahead without exposing themselves. Roads were narrow, muddy, often mined, artillery rained down at random, German infantry, armed with Panzerfausts, could be hiding behind any bush, under any tree, in any barn. Bob's Sherman, the Grey Ghost, led the advance. He kept his eye locked on the M70 sight. The world through the periscope was shaky, dirty, distorted by vibration and moisture. Every bump in the road made his field of vision jump. The tank smelled like hot metal and oil. His ears rang from the constant rumble of the engine and the metallic clank of the treads chewing through mud. Then it happened. From behind a hedge to the left, a sudden glint of steel. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Bob had studied the silhouette of every German armored vehicle in the manual, and what he saw was unmistakable. A Panther tank, partially concealed, turned its hull ever so slightly toward their path. Bob's heart slammed into his chest. He yanked the elevation wheel, lined up the crosshairs. "Target front, Panther, 11 o'clock, he yelled. Sergeant Harrison shouted, "Fire!" Bob squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun barked. The Grey Ghost rocked backward from the recoil. The shell slammed into the enemy tank, but not where Bob had aimed. The sight had jumped. His hands were sweating. His calculations were off. The round struck the Panther's frontal glacis. It bounced. The armor held. The Panther's turret turned toward them, slow and steady, like death-locking eyes. Then came the flash, a brilliant burst from the German gun. The world shook. The shell smashed into the right side of the Sherman's hull, just above the track. Metal screamed. Sparks exploded. Bob was thrown sideways in the turret. Alarms blared. Inside the tank, it felt like a bomb had gone off. The loader, Private Quinn, was screaming. Not from pain, just fear. Pure, raw animal terror. Smoke filled the compartment. The engine stuttered. Then the fire started. It wasn't big at first, just a thin line of flame licking along the ammunition stowage. But Bob knew what came next. He'd seen the diagrams. He'd read the statistics. Once it reached the ammo rack, it would be over. "Out! Out! Out!" Sergeant Harrison roared. The hatch above Bob's head flew open. He grabbed the rim and hauled himself up, boots slipping on the scorched metal. He could feel the heat rising beneath him. The air smelled like burning canvas, oil, and the sickening odor of scorched paint. He dropped to the ground, landing hard on his shoulder, rolling into the mud. Moments later, the rest of the crew tumbled out. All 5 made it by sheer miracle. Then came the second hit. The Panther fired again, this time from 100 yards closer. The round slammed into the turret, detonating inside the already burning Sherman. The entire tank erupted in a fireball. Bob stared as the gray ghost, the machine he had trained with, sweated over and trusted, became nothing more than a smoking carcass of melted steel and shredded armor. He didn't speak. None of them did. They just stood there in the wet grass, smoke in their lungs, hands trembling, clothes soaked in sweat and mud, staring at the ruin of their home. That night, in a makeshift camp behind the line, Bob couldn't sleep. The fire was out, but he kept feeling it on his skin, in his lungs, behind his eyes. The blast replayed in his mind again and again. The Panther's turret, the shell bouncing. The moment he pulled the trigger and realized it hadn't worked. The training manuals had warned them, but nothing prepared him for the guilt. He was the gunner. He had aimed, he had fired, and he had failed. He pulled out the small notebook he always kept in his jacket. His hands still shook. He turned to a fresh page and wrote one sentence, slowly, deliberately. Panther 700 wide, frontal hit, deflected. Then he paused and underlined it twice. Then he wrote a second line, sight jumped during recoil, off by 1 inch. And just like that, the idea was born. He didn't know it yet, but that inch would become everything. The inch that didn't exist, rethinking the gun. The morning after the Panther ambush, the gray ghost was gone. Nothing left but smoke and a charred hull, twisted like melted plastic. But Bob Stanton wasn't dead. And that, to him, felt like a debt. He didn't return to the barracks or write a letter home. He sat alone under a shredded tent tarp, the burnt smell still clinging to his uniform. Notebook in hand, he replayed the scene over and over in his head. The shell had bounced. He knew it wasn't supposed to penetrate the Panther's front plate. Everyone said so, but it had been close. Damn close. He had aimed perfectly, or so he thought, but the sight had jumped just an inch. 1 inch, the length of a thumb joint, the width of a matchbox, the distance between life and death. Bob couldn't shake it, so he went looking for answers. The next day, while his unit regrouped and waited for replacement tanks, Bob tracked down Sergeant Paul Franklin. Franklin was a grizzled veteran who ran the maintenance and calibration section for their armored battalion. He was the kind of guy who could field strip a periscope blindfolded and had memorized every manual the Army had printed. Bob found him hunched over a busted turret motor behind the supply trucks. "Franklin," Bob said quietly, holding up his notebook, "I need to know how the M70 sight is calibrated." Franklin glanced up, an oil-stained rag in one hand, a socket wrench in the other. "You trying to fix one?" he grunted. "I'm trying to figure out why my shot bounced at 700 yards, center mass." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Front plate?" Bob nodded. Franklin chuckled, not kindly. "Then it bounced because you shot the goddamn front of a Panther with a 75mm pop gun. That's not a question, that's physics." Bob didn't blink. He held out his notebook. "I was off by 1 inch. Franklin stopped. "You sure?" Turret was stable. Elevation was set for 700. But during recoil, the gun dropped a fraction. "I think the sight's 0 is misaligned at that range." Franklin sighed and waved him over. They spent the next 3 hours with blueprints, a half-disassembled Sherman turret, and a pile of grease-stained technical diagrams. What they discovered shocked even Franklin. The standard M70 periscope was zeroed at 500 yards during factory calibration. But in the field, few tanks ever fought at that distance. Real engagements, especially in the bocage or during long-range duels, were happening at 600 to 900 yards. At those distances, even the slightest misalignment in the elevation dial, a degree, could shift the point of impact by 12 to 20 inches, and recoil vibration introduced vertical drop, subtle, barely visible, but deadly. Bob flipped to a clean page in his notebook and wrote 1 inch vertical compensation at 700, 800 yards. Adjust sight pre-engagement. Account for elevation loss on recoil. Franklin looked over his shoulder, squinting. "You're planning to mess with the factory 0. Bob nodded. "Just 1 inch manual adjustment. Field only." "That's not standard protocol." "I'm not planning to survive by the book." Franklin shook his head. Then he grinned. "You got guts, Stanton, or maybe you're just, or desperate enough to be right. Over the next week, as new tanks arrived and units reorganized, Bob secretly applied his theory. He took control of a replacement Sherman, also christened Grey Ghost, because some names refused to die, and made one subtle change. He adjusted the elevation dial on the sight to compensate for drop at distance, 1 inch higher at 800 yards. He also made his own firing chart. It wasn't Army issued, it wasn't approved, but it worked. He tested it on wrecked German armor left behind, fired at empty barrels, calculated impact spread, compared groupings. Slowly, surely, he confirmed what he suspected. The 1 inch mattered. It wasn't magic. It didn't make the 75mm gun more powerful. It didn't give the Sherman thicker armor, but it gave the shot a better chance. And in war, sometimes one chance is all you get. The kill shot, when the inch hit home. August 25, 1944, just outside the town of Lama. The fields were open now. Gone were the choking hedgerows of Normandy. Instead, long stretches of flat farmland rolled out beneath the late summer sky, golden wheat waving gently in the breeze. The air was warm, deceptively calm, and Bob Stanton knew it was a lie. The war was not quiet, it was waiting. Bob was now in command of his familiar crew inside the new Grey Ghost, a reissued M4 Sherman, identical in design but different in spirit. This tank bore the scars of new welds, fresh paint, and the nervous anticipation of a crew who had seen what Panther shells could do to one of their own. The briefing was simple. Push east. Intelligence reported enemy armor in retreat, but still capable of rearguard ambushes. They were told to be aggressive. They were told to be fast. But Bob didn't believe in speed anymore. Not when facing a Panther. He believed in precision. He had spent the night before rechecking the sight adjustment, 1 inch up at 800 yards. He had measured, recalibrated, and drilled the numbers into his head like a prayer. At 0800 hours, the Grey Ghost rolled out with 3 other Shermans as part of a forward recon element. The morning sun was just starting to burn through the mist. Fields flanked both sides of the road, broken only by occasional patches of brush or scattered farmhouses. Then came the call over the radio, calm, clinical, deadly. Panther tank, grid reference 132, moving south, heading your way. Bob's throat tightened. He lifted his head just long enough to scan the horizon. And there it was. It wasn't even trying to hide. A Panther, painted in faded yellow with brown camouflage stripes, crested a gentle hill 2,000 feet away, just over 600 meters. It moved slowly, deliberately, the sun glinting off its barrel like a drawn sword. Bob dropped back into the gunner's seat and immediately called out, "Range! 670 yards! Panther dead ahead!" The Grey Ghost stopped. The turret rotated, the gun elevated. Bob's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break the silence before the shot did. He looked through the M70 sight. His sight, now adjusted, his inch. The crosshair settled on the flat plate just below the turret ring, one of the Panther's few vulnerable spots from the front. He took a slow breath, the kind you take when you know your life depends on the next movement of your finger. Sergeant Harrison gave the order, "Take the shot!" Bob squeezed the trigger. The recoil shook the entire tank. The shell roared from the barrel with a crack like thunder splitting the sky. Smoke filled the turret. He didn't blink. Through the haze of the sight, he watched. The shell struck dead center just below the turret ring. There was a moment, a heartbeat of nothing. Then came the fire. The Panther's engine deck exploded in a burst of black smoke and orange flame. A split second later, the turret rocked violently to the side, blowing off the commander's hatch. Flame shot from inside like a dragon's breath. One figure inside managed to climb halfway out before collapsing, limp and on fire. The rest didn't get out. Bob stared. He had done it. 1 shot, 1 kill, a perfect shot. The loader screamed with joy. The commander pounded his shoulder. The driver shouted, "You got him! You got that son of a bitch!" Bob didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He just watched the Panther burn, his eyes wide, his breath shallow, his body still frozen in the shape of the shot. It wasn't just a victory, it was proof. His inch, his forbidden adjustment had worked. He had beaten the myth. The Panther was not invincible, the Sherman was not useless, and the math that said you can't win was wrong. But the moment didn't end. A second Panther rolled into view farther away, maybe 700 yards, cutting across the field to flank them. Bob didn't wait for the order. He swung the turret, rechecked his new range chart, made a minor adjustment, plus 1 inch. Same technique, same aim. Up one, fire. Another round. The turret rocked. The shell screamed across the field and struck the second Panther in its side plate. A bright flash, then smoke. The German tank lurching to a stop, its engine stalling as black smoke poured from its exhaust. No flames this time, but it was disabled. Done. The other Shermans moved in. The column advanced. The line held. Later that day, the crew of the Grey Ghost would find themselves surrounded by handshakes, cheers, and looks of disbelief. 2 Panthers in one morning, 0 casualties. Some said it was luck. Others called it a fluke. Bob just looked at the range chart in his hand and whispered 1 inch. He knew what it was. It was preparation. It was data. It was the refusal to accept failure as fact. It was 1 inch, and it had made all the difference when precision replaces luck. That night, Bob didn't sleep, not because of fear this time, but because of silence. For the first time in weeks, there was no artillery. In the distance, no gunfire on the wind, just the soft hum of insects and the occasional low murmur from tents nearby. The Grey Ghost sat parked at the edge of a field, still warm to the touch, its barrel dark with powder residue, its paint streaked with smoke and scorched dust. Bob sat beside the tank with his back against the tread, knees pulled to his chest, eyes staring at nothing. 2 Panthers in one day, 1 destroyed, 1 disabled, no injuries, no casualties. And yet Bob couldn't shake the image of the German commander, halfway out of the hatch, aflame. He hadn't thought about the men inside when he pulled the trigger. There hadn't been time. It had been math, mechanics, trajectory. Now it was memory. Victory didn't feel the way he expected. It wasn't triumphant. It was heavy. It pressed on his chest like guilt mixed with survival. Sergeant Harrison found him like that, sitting in the dark, staring into the dirt. "You did good today," Harrison said softly. Bob didn't answer. Harrison squatted beside him. "You're allowed to feel something, even when you win." After a long pause, Bob said, "I wasn't supposed to win." "What do you mean?" "I changed the sight. 1 inch higher than regulation. If I hadn't, that shell would have bounced. We'd all be dead." Harrison looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, but we're not." Bob pulled his notebook from his jacket, flipped it open, showed Harrison the scribbled calculations, distance brackets, elevation corrections, recoil estimates. "I've been building this since Normandy," he said. "I didn't know if it would work." Harrison took the notebook, flipped through it slowly, then handed it back. "Write it up," he said. "Make it clean. I want every gunner in the platoon to see it." The next morning, Bob did exactly that. He sat on an empty ammo crate and rewrote his notes as a 1-page guide. He titled it plainly, without ego, "Field Adjustment for M70 Sight, effective ranging between 600 and 900 yards." At the bottom, he added a line, "Recommended adjustment, plus 1 inch vertical elevation at 750 plus yards. Effective at all known engagement distances against Panther frontal armor, verified in live combat." He passed it to Sergeant Harrison, who passed it to the unit captain. Within days, copies made their way to other crews, and something strange happened. People started listening to Bob, the quiet kid from New Hampshire, the one who always scribbled in his notebook, who never spoke unless spoken to. He was now the guy other gunners wanted to sit next to at chow time. "Hey Stanton, what's your correction at 850? Do you ever adjust lateral drift? How did you know it would hold together at that range?" He answered every question, not because he wanted the attention, but because he didn't want them to burn. He knew what fire smelled like. He knew what panic tasted like. And he knew what 1 inch of difference could do. Some of the officers weren't happy. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't in the field manual. But after 3 more confirmed Panther kills using Bob's correction method, no one argued anymore. The Grey Ghost became more than a tank. It became a reference point. Other crews started painting small tick marks on their own elevation dials, tiny lines representing their own Stanton adjustment. It was no longer luck. It was doctrine. But for Bob, the transformation wasn't just technical. Inside, something had shifted. He no longer felt like a passenger in a war machine. He felt like the mind behind the gun, the reason it worked, the reason they lived. And that realization, more than any medal or praise, was what stayed with him, that he had made a difference, that his inch, his tiny, precise rebellion against standard protocol had saved lives. It wasn't just a measurement, it was a mindset, how one man's theory became battlefield truth. By early September of 1944, The tide of war was shifting. The German Wehrmacht, once feared as unstoppable, was now retreating across northern France, but they weren't collapsing. They were adapting, fighting smarter, launching armored counterattacks with precision and desperation, especially in the open country near the Moselle River. And the Panthers, they were still out there, still lethal. But now, so were the gunners who had learned from Bob Stanton. It started in whispers. A gunner from Alpha Company used the Stanton Inch near Nancy and scored a clean kill on a moving Panther at over 800 yards. A week later, 2 Shermans from the 19th Armored Battalion coordinated their fire using Bob's correction and disabled 3 Panthers in under 5 minutes. Word spread like wildfire. They didn't call it Bob's technique. That wasn't his style. In the field, it was just the inch, sometimes the Stanton Inch, and sometimes simply the adjustment. Crews started taping handwritten charts to the insides of their turrets. Small tick marks were scratched into metal beside elevation dials. Training sergeants began unofficially introducing the concept during drills, telling recruits, "This isn't in the book, but if you want to live, remember this." The Army never formally recognized it, but the men on the line did, and for the first time they didn't look at their Shermans as underdogs. They looked at them as tools, sharpened by knowledge, guided by understanding, and capable of victory in the right hands. Bob watched this unfold with quiet amazement. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a hero in the way Hollywood sold it. He was just a guy who didn't like seeing his friends die, a guy who believed that problems had solutions, even in war. And now other gunners were coming to him, not for advice, but to compare notes. They told stories in mess tents, traded correction values like baseball cards. One crew had mapped recoil patterns to determine when to fire between gear shifts. Another used Bob's method to hit a moving Panther at a sloped angle in the rain. One night, during a lull between operations, a junior officer from another division found Bob sitting alone beside his tank, eating cold beans from a tin. "You Stanton?" "Yeah." "You really believe it? The inch?" Bob looked up, wiping his mouth. "No," he said. "I proved it." The officer paused, then handed him a folded paper. An after-action report from a skirmish outside Aracourt. 6 Shermans, 3 Panthers, no American casualties. One line stood out. All crews reported pre-fire elevation compensation of 1 inch, all hits on target. Bob read it twice, then folded the paper and slipped it into his notebook. He didn't smile, he just nodded because he knew what that meant. It meant the idea was no longer his. It belonged to the war now, to the men who fought it, to the ones who survived because of it. And as the Shermans rolled east into Belgium toward the Siegfried Line, Bob saw it in every turret, the chalk marks, the taped notes, the scrolled numbers written by men who understood, finally, that knowledge could kill as surely as steel. The Sherman hadn't changed, the war hadn't changed, but the gunners had, and all because one of them, one quiet man from New Hampshire, had asked, "What if we're just 1 inch off?"